There are moments in history that no one plans for. Moments that happen so fast, in such ordinary settings, that the people involved barely have time to think. And yet those moments carry weight for years, sometimes decades, because of what they reveal about character, power, and the quiet courage of doing what's right when every eye in the room is watching. This is kind of one of those moments. It didn't happen on a battlefield. There was no war, no great speech, no army standing at attention. It happened in a corridor, a polished, quiet, formal corridor inside one of the most recognized institutions in the world. The kind of corridor where footsteps echo and voices are kept low out of habit. Where uniforms are, pressed and faces are expressionless and everyone knows their place. Or at least, that's what one man believed. He believed that rank gave him the right to demand whatever he wanted. He believed that a man in a guard's uniform was beneath him, not just in title, but in worth. He believed that the golden thread on his collar and the weight of his office meant that others were supposed to bend, supposed to yield, supposed to lower their eyes and say yes, sir, without question. He was wrong. And a young prince was about to show him exactly why. The guard's name was Thomas Hadley. He had served in his post for 11 years. 11 years of early mornings, of standing still for long hours, of knowing every door and every face and every routine of the place he protected. He wasn't a flashy man. He didn't seek attention. He basically did his job with quiet dedication, the way men like him always do, not for recognition, but because the work itself mattered. Thomas had grown up in a working-class family in a small English town where men worked hard and said little and took pride in reliability. His father had been a postman for 30 years. His mother had worked in a school kitchen. Neither of them had ever asked for anything they hadn't earned. That was the way Thomas had been raised, and that was the way he had lived. When he joined the Royal Guard, it wasn't out of ambition. He had considered the police force, had considered the military. In the end, a friend told him about the opening, and something about the discipline of it, the precision of it, appealed to him. He liked knowing what was expected. He liked to be fair, the clear lines of duty. He liked pretty much the fact that the work was real, protecting real people, maintaining real order. For 11 years, he had never once caused a scene. He had never raised his voice on duty. He had resolved dozens of small conflicts calmly, professionally, without drama. He was the kind of man who made hard things look easy because he never let them become personal. But, on a Tuesday morning in early autumn, something happened that pushed past every boundary of professional patience he had ever built. The morning had begun normally. Thomas arrived before 6, changed into his uniform, checked his post assignments for the day. The schedule was light, a few internal movements of staff, one external visit from a government liaison, and a small function in the East Wing that afternoon. Nothing unusual, and nothing that suggested the day would be anything other than routine. By 9:30, the building had settled into its working rhythm. Staff moved through corridors with purpose. Pretty much, doors opened and closed. The quiet hum of a large formal institution going about its business filled the air. That was when Lord Edmund Castle arrived. Lord Castle held a senior position in the Administrative Council, a body that oversaw logistics, staffing, and the coordination of official engagements. He had held the position for 8 years, had accumulated considerable influence in that time, and had developed, over those 8 years, a very particular relationship with his own importance. He wasn't a cruel man in the way that loud, obvious men are cruel. He didn't shout. Well, he didn't threaten. His cruelty was quieter, more refined, the kind that comes wrapped in politeness, that dresses itself in procedure, that uses the language of formality to deliver something that's, at its core, contempt. He had in my opinion, way of looking at people that communicated, without a single word, that they were less than him. Not because of anything they had done. Simply because of what they wore, simply because of where they stood. Thomas had dealt with Lord Castle before. Small interactions, mostly. A few times the man had passed through his checkpoint without acknowledging him. Once, he had questioned Thomas's right to delay a visiting dignitary for a routine security check, calling it unnecessary and embarrassing. Thomas had remained calm, explained the procedure, and the matter had been closed. But this Tuesday was different. Lord Castle arrived at Thomas's post just before 10. He was carrying a leather briefcase and walking with the particular kind of purposeful stride that powerful men use when they want everyone around them to know they are important. Beside him walked a young aide, perhaps 25 years old, carrying a folder and looking slightly nervous. Thomas stepped forward as protocol required. "Good morning, Lord Castle. I'll need to verify your clearance for the East Corridor this morning. There's been a schedule adjustment and we're running a limited access window." Funny enough, Lord Castle stopped. He looked at Thomas. Not at his face, at his uniform. As if he were reading a sign. As if Thomas himself weren't quite a person yet, just a title stitched onto cloth. "I beg your pardon?" Lord Castle said, very quietly. "Clearance verification for what it's worth, the East Corridor, sir. It will only take a moment. I've been walking through that corridor for 8 years. Yes, sir. And, normally this wouldn't be required. But, there's been a schedule change this morning, and I've been instructed to verify all access during this window, regardless of rank." Lord Castle set his briefcase down. Not on the floor, he handed it to his aide without looking at the young man, as if the aide's hands existed for exactly this purpose and nothing else. He clasped his own hands in front of him. He tilted his head very slightly, and, "You are going to stand there," he said, "and tell me, a lord of this council, that I need to show you my papers. I'm going to ask you for verification, yes, sir? It's the same for everyone this morning. Just my take. It isn't the same for everyone." His voice had dropped to something very precise, very deliberate. "Men of my position don't wait at checkpoints. Men of my position are not stopped by men of your position. And if you don't step aside right now, I'll ensure that your superior is informed of this obstruction before noon." Thomas held his ground. "I understand your frustration, Lord Castle. I can contact your secretary immediately if that would help clarify the new protocol for you. But, basically, I'm not able to wave through unverified access during a restricted window. That is my instruction, and I'll follow it." There was a silence. Lord Castle's expression didn't change, exactly. But, actually, something shifted in it, a tightening around the eyes, a slight lift of the chin. The aide beside him had gone very still, the way people go still when they sense that something is about to happen and they don't want to be part of it. "I see," Lord Castle said. He picked up his briefcase again. "You are going to regret this." And, honestly, he didn't shout it. He didn't snarl it. He said it the way a man says something he fully believes, calmly, as a statement of fact. Then, he turned to his aide and said, "Get me the head of security. Now." What Lord Castle didn't know, what neither he nor his aide had enticed, was that they weren't alone in that corridor. 20, I think, feet behind them, having come through a side entrance that opened quietly and, without announcement, stood Prince George. He was 28 years old at the time. Tall, with the kind of build that suggested he had actually used his body. For something besides ceremony, broad in the shoulder, steady in the way he stood. He was dressed plainly for a member of the royal family, dark trousers, a pale blue shirt, no insignia, no formal jacket. He had been on his way to a private meeting in the East Wing, a meeting that had nothing to do with Lord Castle and everything to do with a young veterans' charity he had been supporting quietly for the better part of 2 years. He had entered the corridor and stopped. Like, he had watched. He had heard the entire exchange. There are certain things that Prince George had been known for among the staff who worked around him. Not publicly, not in the press, but in the quiet world of people who observed him daily. He was known for remembering names. Asking after the families of people who served around him. For treating groundskeepers and secretaries and security guards with the same direct, attentive courtesy that he gave to politicians and ambassadors. It wasn't a performance, it had the quality of something deeply habitual, something built in from early in his life by someone or many people who understood that how you treat those with less power than you is the truest measure of character. He watched Lord Castle's face. He heard the words, "You're going to regret this." He saw the young aide scramble to reach for his phone with shaking hands. And he felt something rise in him, not anger exactly. Something quieter than anger but considerably more durable. Well, he walked forward. His footsteps were unhurried. He, in my opinion, covered the 20 feet between them at an easy pace, and, when he reached the small group assembled at Thomas's post, he stopped beside Thomas and looked at Lord Castle with a calm, clear expression. "Lord Castle," he said. Lord Castle turned. The expression on his face shifted rapidly through several states: surprise, recalibration. Then, the careful, practiced composure of a man who has spent years learning to adjust his social register very quickly. "Your Royal Highness," he said. "I wasn't aware." "I guess I know," said Prince George. He glanced at Thomas, briefly, with something in his eyes that Thomas would later describe to his wife as steady. Like he'd already made up his mind before he even opened his mouth. Then, he looked back at Lord Castle, and Thomas is doing his job, the prince said. He is following a protocol that exists to protect everyone in this building, including you. I watched that exchange from the moment you approached. And I want to be very clear with you about something. Lord Castle opened his mouth. "I'd like to finish," said the prince, pleasantly. "What I sort of watched was a man doing his duty being threatened for it. You told him he would regret this, and I'd like you to understand that the only thing that's going to be regretted here's that interaction, and I mean that on your part, not his." The corridor was very quiet. "I'm going to ask you to present your verification to Thomas now," the prince continued. "And then, I'd like you to think, seriously, about what it says about a man when the only way he knows how to respond to courtesy is with a threat." Lord Castle stood absolutely still. The aide beside him had lowered his phone. His face had gone through its own sequence of expressions and had settled, now, on something that looked almost like relief. Prince George didn't raise his voice once. He didn't use a single formal title or ceremony to make his point. He simply stood there, even-tempered and completely unmovable, and said what needed to be said with the quiet clarity of a man who has thought about what fairness actually means and decided he's willing to say it out loud. Castle reached into his jacket and produced his verification card. He held it out. Thomas took it, processed it in the required system, handed it back. To be fair, whole thing took 40 seconds. "Plus, thank you," said Thomas. Lord Castle didn't respond to Thomas. He looked, instead, at Prince George, a lone, unreadable look. Then, he picked up his briefcase, nodded his head in the smallest possible acknowledgement of the prince, and walked into the east corridor with his aide close behind. The thing is, Prince George stood beside Thomas for a moment after they had gone. He didn't make a speech. He didn't deliver a moral. He just stood honestly, there in the way that some people do when they've finished doing something they felt was simply necessary and have no particular interest in being celebrated for it. "You handled that well," he'd said to Thomas. Thomas, who had spent 11 years learning how to keep his face professionally neutral in difficult situations, found that his voice, when he spoke, was slightly less steady than usual. "Thank you, sir." "No," said the prince, and he looked at him directly. "Thank you. That kind of thing isn't easy to hold your ground on. I know that." He held Thomas's gaze for a moment, not in the searching, testing way of someone who wants something, but in the simple, direct way of someone who wants to make sure they are understood. Then, he nodded once and walked into the east corridor. Thomas stood at his post for a few seconds after the prince disappeared around the corner. The corridor was quiet again. Everything was back to its ordinary state, the polished floor, the closed doors, the distant sound of the building going about its day. But something had changed, and not in the corridor. Inside Thomas. In the honestly part of him that had stood there and held his ground against a man who was trying to use rank as a weapon, and had wondered, in that cold moment when Lord Castle's voice had gone quiet and precise, whether it was worth it. Whether the fight was worth having. Whether the line he was holding meant anything to anyone else or whether he was simply a man in a uniform standing alone. It had meant something, it had meant enough for a young prince to walk 20 feet across a corridor and say so out loud. That, Thomas would think later, was the part that stayed with him. Not the confrontation, not the outcome. The fact that someone had seen it. The fact that someone had cared enough to stop. In the days that followed, the story spread quietly through the building the way these things always do, not through official channels, not through announcements, but through the underground network of people who work in the same place and trust each other. Kitchen staff told security staff. Administrative assistants told maintenance workers. By the end of the week, most people who worked in that building knew what had happened in the East Corridor on that Tuesday morning. And almost all of them felt, in some form, the same thing Thomas had felt. That it mattered. That it was right. And that the person who had made it right had done so not because it was his duty, not because it served him, but simply because he believed it was the correct thing to do. There are many ways to measure a person of great privilege. You can measure them by their speeches, by their public commitments, by the causes they champion in front of cameras and reporters and applauding crowds. Or you can measure them by what they do in a corridor when no one important is watching and a man who cannot fight back is being told he will regret doing his job. Prince George had been measured that morning in the simplest and most accurate way possible. And he hadn't been found wanting. The news of what had happened in the East Corridor didn't travel in straight lines. It moved the way all true things move through institutions, sideways, slowly, through trusted voices and lowered tones and conversations that began with "did you hear?" and ended with a kind of silence that meant the person listening was turning it over in their mind, weighing it, deciding what to do with it. It moved through the kitchens and the postrooms and the staff break areas. It moved through the offices of junior administrators and senior secretaries. It moved upward and downward and across the building's invisible social geography with the natural momentum of something that had genuinely surprised people. Because it had. Not the confrontation itself. Confrontations happened, and men like Lord Castle had been using rank as a weapon for as long as rank had existed, and men like Thomas had been absorbing those blows quietly for just as long, most of the time, because that was the practical reality of the world they worked in, and the alternative open conflict with someone who held all the formal power was rarely one that ended well for the person wearing the uniform. People who worked in buildings like that one understood the mathematics of those situations without having to think about them consciously. What surprised people was the prince. Not because they thought he was unkind. Plus, not because they had reason to believe he would stand by while something unfair happened. But, because, in their experience, people at his level of the hierarchy, the absolute top, the place where privilege becomes so dense it warps the air around it, those people didn't intervene in corridor disputes. Those people moved through the building on a separate track entirely, a track that ran parallel to the one Thomas and his colleagues occupied without ever touching it. They were seen but unseeing. Present but, somehow removed from the ordinary friction of the place. Prince George I had stepped off that track. He had walked 20 feet across a corridor and put himself squarely in the middle of a situation. That hadn't thing to do with him and everything to do with what was right. And he had done it without drama, without performance, without any of the theatrical gestures of public virtue that people in his position sometimes deployed when they wanted to be seen doing good. He had done it the way a person does something they genuinely believe in, quietly, directly, and without waiting to be thanked. That was what people were turning over in their minds as the story spread. That was what made it land differently than the usual institutional gossip. Honestly. Thomas went home that evening to a small house in a suburb 20 minutes from the city center. His wife, Margaret, was making dinner when he came through the door. She was a practical woman, a nurse who worked long shifts and had little patience for complaint but considerable capacity for listening when something actually mattered. She had been married to Thomas for 17 years. She knew the sound of his footsteps on the front mat and she knew, before he said a word, that the day had been something other than ordinary. He, I think, told her over dinner. He told her the way he told her most things, straightforwardly, without decoration, in the order that things had happened. He told her about Lord Castle's words. He told her about the cold precision of the threat. He told her about the moment when he had stood there, holding his ground, not entirely sure whether what he was doing was brave or simply foolish, knowing only that he couldn't step aside without surrendering something that mattered. And then, he told her about Prince George. Margaret listened to the whole thing without interrupting. She was very still while he spoke, which was her way. When he had finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, she said something that Thomas kept with him for a long time afterward. She said, he didn't have to do that. He chose to, you know? It seems like a small observation. But, in the context of everything Thomas had felt standing in that corridor, it was the right one. Because there's a profound difference between doing something because you're expected to and doing something because you believe it to be right. One is performance, which the other is character. And, the gap between them, in the moment of actually choosing, is larger than most people realize until they are standing inside it. What Thomas didn't know, and would not learn until much later, was that his story had reached a second set of ears by the following afternoon. The head of the security division, a woman named Director Catherine Marsh, had been doing her job for 14 years. She wasn't easily impressed. She had seen the full range of human behavior inside that building, the petty, the noble, the cowardly and, the brave, the vast middle territory of people simply trying to get through their days without incident. She had a considerable regard for Thomas basically, having watched him work for 11 of his 11 years in the post. She considered him one of the most reliable members of her staff, not just technically skilled, but morally reliable, which she privately rated as the more important of the two qualities. When the story reached her, relayed by a junior administrator who had heard it from a colleague who had been in a nearby office when Lord Castle passed through, visibly unsettled, she listened to all of it without changing her expression. Then, she thanked the administrator and sat for a while at her desk. She had two concerns. The first was Thomas, which Lord Castle had said, explicitly, that he would ensure the head of security was informed. He hadn't followed through on that, perhaps because of what had happened next, perhaps because, on reflection, he had decided it was better to let the matter dissolve than to escalate it, but the threat had been made. In Catherine's experience, threats made by people with institutional power rarely disappeared entirely. They accumulated. They waited, and then, when an opportunity presented itself, they were deployed. She didn't want, Thomas to be caught off guard. The second concern was a professional one, not about Thomas, but about the protocol itself. If Lord Castle had genuinely believed he was exempt from the access verification, that suggested a gap in the communication of the new security measures. That was a practical problem she needed to address regardless of everything else. She sent 2 messages that afternoon. One to Thomas, asking him to stop by her office at the end of his shift. One to the Administrative Council's office, requesting a briefing on the East Wing security protocols. Thomas came to her office at 6:15, still in his uniform, looking as composed as ever but, with something slightly more watchful in his eyes than usual. She offered him a seat. She offered him tea. He took the tea. "I wanted to talk about yesterday morning," she said. "I figured," Thomas said. "Tell me what happened, in your own words." He told her. The same version he had told Margaret, the same straightforward account without embellishment. When he finished, Catherine set down her pen. "Did Lord Castle contact this office?" Thomas asked. "No," she said. Plus, there was a pause. "I want you to know," Catherine said carefully, "that you followed correct procedure. You were within your authority, you communicated clearly, you remained professional under a lot of pressure. Whatever Lord Castle says or does from this point forward, the record is clean." Thomas nodded. "I also want to tell you," she continued, "that I am going to document this incident formally. Not to punish anyone. To protect you. Because men like Lord Castle have long memories, and I'd prefer to have the facts on paper before anything else happens." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "I appreciate that," he said. "Good." She picked up her pen again and looked back at her notes. "You know," then, she looked up. "And, the other thing. The prince, you know?" Thomas said nothing, but his expression changed slightly, just the corners of his eyes, a small softening. "That isn't," Catherine said, with the closest thing to warmth she allowed herself at work, "something that happens often." "No," Thomas agreed. "I don't imagine it does." One more thing, Lord Castle, in the days following the incident, moved through the building differently. this was enticed by several people who had occasion to observe him regularly: his aide, who walked with him each morning, the reception staff who greeted him as he entered, the junior council members who sat near him in meetings. They noticed that he was quieter. That his voice, which had always carried the particular assured quality of a man who expected to be heard, had dropped in volume. That he no longer walked past security checkpoints with the confident sweep of someone who considers himself exempt from ordinary procedure. He submitted his verification without comment every morning. It was a small change. And, yet in the social ecology of that building, it registered. People who had worked around him for years noticed it, even if they couldn't always name exactly what had shifted. Something in the air around him was different. The certainty, the untouchability, the particular quality of a man who has never seriously been called to account, that was thinner now. Not gone. Plus, thinner. Prince George hadn't reported him. Had, in my opinion, not filed a complaint. Had made no official record of what he had witnessed. He had simply said, in the clearest and quietest terms possible, that what Lord Castle was doing was wrong, and that the person he was doing it to had the right to do his job without being threatened. And, somehow, the absence of formal consequence made the actual consequence heavier. Because Lord Castle couldn't respond to it the way he responded to official processes, by lawyering up, by pulling rank, by activating the network of favors and alliances that had protected him for years. There wasn't anything to respond to. There was only the memory of standing in that corridor and being told, by someone whose word carried more weight than anyone else's in the building, that his behavior said something about him. Men who, in my opinion, have spent their careers being protected from consequence find that kind of reckoning harder to absorb than anything formal. Formal consequences have procedures and timelines and the comforting bureaucracy of process. The kind of consequence Lord Castle had received was different. It lived in him now. And he couldn't procedurally remove it. Which is cool. 3 weeks after the incident, Thomas was at his post on a quiet Friday afternoon when Prince George passed through the corridor again. The prince was with 2 colleagues this time, deep in a conversation about something, and Thomas didn't expect him to do anything other than walk past. But, as he drew level with Thomas's post, he paused. The 2 colleagues continued a half-step before noticing and stopping as well. Thomas, the prince said. Thomas straightened. Sir, basically, how are things? It was a simple question. The kind people ask without expecting a real answer. But, the way the prince asked it, with actual attention in his eyes, head slightly tilted, fully present in the way that most people in his position rarely managed, made it clear that a real answer was welcome. Good, Thomas said. Quiet, mostly, which how are you, sir? Something in the prince's expression shifted, a brief, genuine amusement. Busy, he said. But, fine. He looked at Thomas for a moment longer. No more trouble? No more trouble, Thomas confirmed. You know, the prince nodded. Something passed across look, his face, not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. Then, he rejoined his colleagues and continued down the corridor. Thomas watched them go, and he had been doing this job for 11 years. In that time, pretty much, he had been invisible to a great many important people. He had held doors and verified credentials and stood in corridors and made himself, in the way that people in his position learn to do, almost architecturally part of the space present, but not noticed. Not as a person. As a function. In the space of 1 week, 2 things had happened to change that. He had been threatened by a man with power who wanted him to feel small. And he had been seen by a man with considerably more power who wanted him to feel the opposite. The contrast between those 2 things was something Thomas turned over in his mind for months afterward. Not with bitterness about Lord Castle, he had made his peace with that quickly, the way practical men do. But, with a kind of quiet gratitude that surprised him with its depth. Because it is one thing to believe that doing the right thing is worth it. It is another thing entirely to be shown, by someone whose position made the showing meaningful, that it actually is. In the broader world outside that building, none of this was known. There had been no press coverage, no social media account of the incident, no official statement. It existed only in the private knowledge of the people who had been there and the people they had told, that careful, trust-based network of shared experience that runs underneath the visible surface of institutional life. But it shaped things, and the way all quiet truths shape things, not through announcement, but through accumulation. Through the way people began to speak a little differently to their junior colleagues. Through the way a few supervisors who had grown comfortable with small cruelties began to notice the discomfort those cruelties created in the people around them. Through the way Thomas's colleagues stood slightly straighter at their posts, not out of formality, but out of something more like dignity. No one could have traced this back to a single Tuesday morning and a 20-foot walk across a corridor. But that's how I guess influence actually works most of the time. Not in grand gestures. I think, in small ones. In the kind of moment that seems contained to a single corridor but whose meaning spreads outward through the people who hear about it and carry it with them. Thomas carried it with him, and Prince George, who had already moved on to the next thing, as people always do after they simply do what they believe is right, probably never knew quite how far it traveled. Some things don't need to be known to matter. They simply happen, and they spread, and the world quietly, unremarkably, in ways that no newspaper reports, becomes a fraction more like it should be. That was the first part of what this story is about. The second, for what it's worth, part hadn't yet begun. There are certain kinds of events that don't announce their importance at the time they happen. They arrive without fanfare. They pass without ceremony. And only later, sometimes weeks later, sometimes years, does their full weight become clear. Does the shape of what changed become visible? Does the person at the center of it understand, fully, what that moment cost them and what it gave them and what it made of them in the long, slow aftermath? Thomas Hadley's reckoning came 6 months after the incident in the East Corridor. It came not through any dramatic confrontation or institutional review, but through a letter. A single sheet of heavy cream paper, the kind used for formal correspondence within the institution, folded precisely into thirds. Placed in the internal mail with nothing on the envelope except his name and post designation. He found it in his box on a Wednesday morning, between a shift schedule and a memo about updated parking arrangements. He opened it at his post during a quiet period, leaning slightly against the wall in the way he always did when he read, not lazily, just comfortably, the posture of a man at ease in a space he had occupied for over a decade. The letter informed him that he had been nominated, by 2 independent sources within the institution, for the Internal Staff Recognition Award. A commendation given annually to members of security and maintenance staff who had highlighted exceptional commitment to the standards and values of the institution. The letter named the award, explained the nomination process, and invited him to attend a small ceremony in 6 weeks. It didn't name the people who had nominated him. Thomas read the letter twice, which then, he folded it back into thirds, tucked it into his jacket pocket, and stood at his post for the remaining 4 hours of his shift with an expression that, to any observer, would have looked exactly like his normal expression. But, inside, something was different. Something had arrived in him through that letter that he hadn't realized he had been waiting for, not the recognition itself, exactly. Something beneath the recognition. The understanding that what he had done had been seen, and named, and judged to be worth saying aloud. He told Margaret that evening, which she read the letter standing in the kitchen, still wearing her coat from her own long day, and, when she finished she looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then, she folded the letter carefully and handed it back. I knew, she said. He looked at her. Not the letter, she clarified. I knew what you did mattered. I knew it from the way you told me about it. She paused. You were different after that day. You were straighter somehow. Like you'd remembered something. Thomas thought about that. He wasn't a man who talked easily about the interior life, the private country of feeling that most men of his generation and class kept carefully defended from language. But, Margaret had been inside that country with him for 17 years, and she knew its geography better than he did. I think that's right, he said, finally. I think I'd forgotten something. What? He was quiet for a long moment. That it's worth it, he said. Plus, holding the line. Doing it right even when someone powerful tells you to step back. He looked at his hands, the hands of a working man, solid and undecorative. I'd been doing the job so long I'd stopped thinking about why. You know, it was just habit. And then, that morning, when Castle started that, I'd to decide whether I actually believed it or whether it was just a habit. And I believed it. He smiled, very slightly. I was glad to find that out. The ceremony was held in a small wood-paneled room in the East Wing on a Thursday afternoon in late winter. It wasn't a large event. 20 people, perhaps 25, most of them staff members who had been similarly nominated or who had come to support those who had. Director Catherine Marsh was there, in her good jacket, sitting very straight the way she always did. A few administrative-like heads, which 2 or 3 representatives from the council. And, to the surprise of almost everyone in the room, Prince George. He, I guess, wasn't the one presenting the awards. That honor belonged to the Director of Operations, a solid, square-shouldered woman named Harriet Broom, who ran the function side of the institution with quiet ferocity and had been doing so for 21 years. But he was in the room, seated in the second row, and, when Thomas walked to the front to receive his commendation, the prince was one of the first people to begin applauding. Not the loudest. Not the most demonstrative. Just the first. Thomas shook Director Broom's hand. He accepted the look-framed certificate with both hands and held it the way he held most things, carefully, with full attention, as if whatever was in his hands deserved the whole of him. He thanked the director briefly. He thanked Catherine Marsh with his eyes across the room. He returned to his seat. Plus, afterward, for what it's worth, during the informal reception, tea, small sandwiches, the particular low-grade social anxiety of junior staff mingling with senior ones, Prince George made his way across the room to where Thomas was standing. "Congratulations," the prince said. "Thank you for coming, sir," Thomas said. "I wasn't expecting." "I know." The prince accepted a cup of tea from a passing tray and took a sip, looking around the room for a moment. "These things matter," he said, almost to himself. Then, he looked back at Thomas. "You know that already, of course." "I gotta say, I'm starting to feel it more clearly," Thomas said. The prince pretty much studied him for a moment, not in the way a superior studies a subordinate, but in the way one honest person studies another when they are trying to be accurate. 6 months basically ago, he said, when I walked past that checkpoint. You looked like a man who'd made a decision and was fully committed to it. That's not a common thing. Thomas considered this. I'd some doubt, he admitted. Plus, of course you did. That's different from wavering. You can have doubt and still hold. The prince turned his tea in his hands. The doubt is what makes it real. If you'd felt nothing, if it had been easy, it wouldn't have meant as much. Real talk, Thomas thought about that for the rest of the evening and for a long time afterward. Lord Castle resigned from his position on the Administrative Council 4 months after the corridor incident. The official reason given was that he wished to pursue opportunities in the private sector, a phrase that in institutional language covers a spectrum of departures from the genuinely voluntary to the gently but firmly encouraged. Those who knew the internal climate of the council in those months leaned toward the latter interpretation. There had been, in the weeks following the incident, a quiet but significant shift in how several senior figures viewed Lord Castle, not because they had been told what to happen, not because any formal process had been initiated, but because the story had reached them and they had been forced to weigh what they knew of him against what they had heard. Reputation is a strange thing. It is built slowly, over years, through accumulation, 100 small interactions, 100 smaller choices, 1,000 moments of being seen or not seen. And it can basically be damaged not by a single catastrophic failure but by a single moment of clarity in which the truth of a person's character becomes suddenly, undeniably visible to the people who have the power to shape their institutional future. Lord Castle had honestly been that visible, for one moment, in the East Corridor. And some of the people who had subsequently heard the story were the exact people whose regard he needed for hold his position with the same authority he had previously enjoyed. He left quietly. He sent no all-staff email. He cleared his office over a weekend and took his parking permit and his 8 years of accumulated institutional gravity and moved it somewhere else. Thomas heard about it from Catherine Marsh, who told him in the same neutral, factual way she told him most things. She watched his face carefully when she said it. Thomas nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Then, he said something that surprised Catherine, because it was so entirely characteristic of him that she felt, afterward, that she should have predicted it. He said, I hope it's better for him somewhere else. Catherine sat with that for a moment. Then, to be fair, she said, why? Because, Thomas said simply, being that way must be exhausting. Having to make everything about rank all the time. Never being able, to just be wherever you're without needing it to mean something about how important you're. He shrugged, a small, almost invisible movement. That's not a comfortable life. I've been lucky. I know where my worth is. Funny enough, and where's that? Catherine asked. He looked at her. In the work, he said, and in doing it right. She thought about that for a long time after he left her office. The veterans' charity that Prince George had been quietly supporting, the one he had been on his way to discuss on that Tuesday morning in the East Corridor, was formally announced 6 months after his corridor intervention. It was called the Ground Level Foundation, and its stated purpose was to provide mental health and career support services to veterans transitioning out of active military service. Not the kind of charity that fills ballrooms with donors and glossy programs. The kind that opens small offices in ordinary towns and staffs them with people who have actually been through what the veterans have been through. In the announcement, the prince said something in a short written statement that circulated widely in the days following the launch. He said that the purpose of the foundation wasn't to celebrate veterans from a distance but to stand beside them in the work of rebuilding. He said he had learned, over the years, that the distance between wanting to help and actually helping was always shorter than it seemed, and that the only thing keeping most people on the wrong side of it was the decision. Thomas read the statement. He read it once, then sat with it. Then, he read it again, which he thought about 20 feet. About the space between where a person is standing and where a person is needed. About what it takes to cover that distance, not in terms of steps, but in terms of will, in terms of the decision to stop being a bystander in the ordinary suffering of someone with less power than you. He sent a small donation to the Ground Level Foundation that evening. It wasn't a large amount, he wasn't a wealthy man, but it was given with the kind of deliberateness that makes small amounts mean more than they look. He didn't tell anyone he had done this. The following year, Thomas was promoted to a senior security coordinator role, a position that involved less time at checkpoint posts and more time in operational planning, training junior staff, and helping develop the communication protocols for new security procedures. It was a role that suited him in ways the posting itself perhaps hadn't fully anticipated, because what the promotion board had valued was his technical reliability, but what his new colleagues discovered almost immediately was something more than that. He was a teacher, not formally, not with any training in pedagogy or any particular facility for abstraction. But, in the natural, practical, daily enacted way that some people teach simply by being entirely themselves in front of people who are watching. He was the same at his new desk as he had been at his checkpoint. He gave the same weight to every interaction. He treated his junior colleagues with the same direct, unflashy respect that he had always given to the people he worked alongside. And, when new staff, young men and women in the first months of their posting, came to him with questions, he answered them with the patience of someone who understood that not knowing something isn't the same as not being worth knowing. Gradually, and then, all at once, in the way these things always happen, the small culture of the security division shifted. It wasn't a revolution. It was actually something quieter and more durable. The tone of the briefings changed. The way supervisors spoke to junior staff in the corridors changed. The subtle, accumulated pressure to perform invisibility, to make oneself architecturally part of the space rather than a person in it, eased. No one gave a speech about it. No policy was changed. But something in the air was different, and those who had been there long enough could, if pressed, trace it back to a moment. A Tuesday morning. A corridor. A man who pretty much held his post and a prince who walked across a room. Years later, Thomas would be asked, in an internal staff interview conducted for an institutional history archive, to describe the most significant moment of his career. It was a standard question. Most people answered it with a reference to a public event, a high-profile visit, a security incident successfully managed, a moment of professional recognition. Thomas thought for a moment. Then, he said, there was a morning when someone tried to tell me that my job didn't matter unless I made it easy for them. And I to decide whether I believed him. I gotta say, the interviewer waited. The decision was the significant part, Thomas said. Not what came after it. The decision itself, which because once you've made it, once you've stood in a moment like that and chosen to hold, something about yourself you didn't know before. And you can't unknow it. It changes how you move through everything afterward. He paused. And, pretty much, then, someone walked across a room to tell me I was right. That mattered too. He looked at his hands. Maybe more than I expected. There's no single lesson to pull from a story like this. Stories that are actually true resist the neat extraction of single lessons, because real life is too full of texture, contradiction and the sheer complexity of human motivation for any one moral to contain it. But there are things that this story shows, even if it cannot say them simply. It shows that power isn't the same as authority. Lord Castle had power, institutional, formal, backed by years of accumulated position. But he didn't have authority over Thomas's sense of duty, and, when he tried to claim it anyway, he revealed something about the limits of what power can actually do when it runs into a person who knows their worth. It shows that courage isn't the absence of doubt. Thomas doubted. He stood in that corridor with doubt rising through him like cold water, and he held his post anyway. The courage wasn't in being unafraid, which it was in acting rightly despite the fear. It shows that proximity matters. Prince George was 20 feet away, and 20 feet. The smallest intervention, a walk, a few quiet sentences, an expression of clarity rather than aggression, changed the shape of what happened next, not just for Thomas, but for the culture of an entire institution. Most of us are within 20 feet of something that needs someone to step toward it. Most of us are looking at the distance and calculating the cost. And it shows, perhaps most importantly of all, that the stories we don't tell publicly are often the ones that shape us most completely. Lord Castle's departure was never in a newspaper. Thomas's promotion wasn't announced anywhere. The ground level foundation was reported briefly and, without drama. Prince George's 20-foot for what it's worth walk wasn't photographed or filmed or quoted by anyone with a platform. It happened in a corridor. Between real people. In the ordinary, unwitnessed, fully consequential fabric of a Tuesday morning. And it mattered more than most of the things that were photographed that week. That is the thing about real life. It doesn't wait for an audience. It doesn't arrange itself for a good angle. It happens in corridors and kitchens and small offices and ordinary moments, and it asks of the people inside it one simple question: what kind of person are you going to be right now? Thomas Hadley answered that question on a Tuesday in early autumn, standing at a checkpoint with his ground underneath him and his duty clear. Prince George answered it 20 feet away, walking across a corridor. Both of them, in their different ways, got it right. And, because they did, because those two answers aligned, in that one unremarkable corridor, on that one unremarkable morning, the world around them became, in ways large and small and mostly invisible, a better place to live and work in. That is enough. That is, in fact, more than enough. Honestly, that is everything,